some groups have been proposing. AIPAC's behind it. The organization that I start working for on February 1 is behind it as well, called the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. A lot of organizations are behind this right now, and the idea is that if we can sanction the companies that are working with Iran to refine its petroleum and make it more difficult for that petroleum to come in, we can essentially shut down the lifeblood of the Iranian regime, make that so painful for them that they will ultimately have to decide whether it's worth it for them to continue on this path of trying to develop a nuclear weapon. I don't know if it can work, but I don't think that relying on demonstrations in the streets will work. I don't think that asking Israel to take the brunt of an attack is going to work. It doesn't appear that there's political will in our country to launch an attack against Iran, given the fact that we're already spread thin in Iraq and Afghanistan. I would say that the average sort of approach on the street is that we're somewhat war weary. The average American is sort of tired of hearing about all the different conflicts that we're in. The last thing we want to do is open up another front. So I would think that this has, I'm not saying that sanctions have ever really worked in the past, but this has at least got a shot. And that's where I'm hoping we see things go in terms of our Iran policy in the months to come. I think this is going to be a critical issue. Yeah?
But would that have to be broad sanctions? And I'm not sure Europe would step up.
That's part of the problem. Russia would also need to step up. China would need to step up. I believe that that's essentially correct. However, if the United States takes the lead and says we're doing this, here's why we're doing it, and as soon as Iran acquiesces or stands down from its nuclear program, we will stand down from these sanctions. But in other words, takes the lead on these things. There's nothing wrong with imposing unilateral sanctions and hoping that you get them to become multilateral. But by saying that we don't want to do it at all, I think sends a very disjointed message. We should stand for something, because right now what I'm seeing is a policy that says, well, we hope that talking to them is going to work, and we don't want to impose sanctions because we can't get anybody else to work with us, and we don't want to attack Iran because we can't open up another front, and we don't want to provide the Israelis, by the way, with the codes to attack Iran. So essentially we're signaling to the Iranians that we have our hands tied. We need to do something. And I believe that these sanctions at least could send a signal that we're serious, that we want to do something and we're willing to at least start a process. And basically say, this is a stick. We will pull back as soon as you pull back, but at least have a piece on the table. The Iranians are chess players, and they're looking at us and they're saying they don't have a piece to play with right now, other than a nuclear response, which no one in this country has a stomach for right now. So we've got to start thinking outside the box. Yes, sir?
Follow the money. Your time at Treasury.
Yes.
Were you able to identify sources of funds? Is it coming from, can't be all from the Iranians, it must be Saudi Arabia. What's the financial
the funds
formula
to all the terrorist groups or to specifics?
Well, specifically, Palestinian Hamas group and the rest of the Middle East.
All right. Well, the question was from my experience at the Treasury Department. Can I explain a little bit about the money trail? As you've probably heard, if I tell you anything really specific, I'd probably have to kill you. So I don't want to do that tonight. But what I can tell you is that the Saudis are a major problem. There was a group of Saudis in the 1990s that were largely responsible for financing Al-Qaeda. They were known as the Golden Chain. And you can look it up. It's a fascinating story. They were former ministers and oil magnates, construction magnates. These are people that were part of the Saudi Arabia boom and then ultimately went on to fund Al-Qaeda. And we know that's the case, and we know that the Saudis, I think, are still, to some extent, a problem, although, we now know that there are Europeans and others involved. As far as Hamas is concerned, what's interesting is that Saudi was involved in the financing of Hamas in its early years, as was Bahrain, Qatar, a lot of other Gulf Arab states. But in the year 2003, it actually marked a turning point. In 2003, I don't know if anybody recalls, there was a series of attacks that took place inside the House of Saud. There were Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. It was an affiliate group, a group of people that were loosely tied to Al-Qaeda. And they began to launch attacks throughout the Saudi kingdom. The Saudis did a little soul searching and realized that, hey, you know what? We've been financing these, bad guys all around the world, and oops, it's come back to bite us. We have a case of what we call blowback, similar to what happened when the United States sponsored the Mujahideen of Afghanistan in the 1980s. You sponsor radicals someplace else, and they can come back to bite you, so to speak. So the Saudis realized that this was an ill-advised policy. And so what they decided to do was to start curtailing their funding to Hamas. And it was at that point that Iran stepped in and began to really start throwing money. They had always been involved in helping the training and had sponsored parts of the Hamas organization, but had never really taken ownership. Now, after the United States and Israel put sanctions on Hamas after the 2006 election, Ahmadinejad openly stated that he would cover whatever Hamas could not fulfill of its budget. Openly stated it was going to be a blank check. So the Iranians are very open about their support for Hamas, and I would expect them to continue to do that as long as they can continue to export oil, which ultimately comes back again to that Refined Petroleum Sanctions Act, which I think is going to be critical for this country's Iran policy. Yes, sir.
You mentioned before that you see ultimately that Israel will have to make concessions. I think those were basically your words. What I have observed is that Israel has made many, many concessions, and it seems to, like them as well, that it doesn't matter how many concessions are given, how many requests are granted, and maybe part of it is that there is no real leadership. But in truth, what is Israel supposed to do without cutting itself off from its own lifeline? And one example that I could never really understand is how could Israel have given up the Philadelphia road control and without any foresight as to what might have happened with all the construction of tunnels and the import of all the missiles and rockets and whatnot?
Well, it's ironic. They gave up the entire Gaza Strip and the Philadelphia corridor, even knowing that those tunnels existed already. In other words, I mean, the withdrawal took place in 2005, and the tunnel problem really began around 2002, 2003, and the Qassam rocket problem began in late 2001. So, in other words, Israel already knew what it was getting into in that instance. But I think you're right in general that concessions have really not won Israel anything over the years. And it actually, I always come back to an axiom that my old boss, Daniel Pipes, still loves to say, and that is, you don't make peace with your enemies, you make peace with your former enemies. And that is ultimately the crux of what Israel continues to struggle with. Israel continues to try to throw concessions at the Palestinians when the Palestinians are still not, I mean, the conflict exists because the Palestinians still refuse to accept the state of Israel. Another famous quip is that if the Palestinians laid down their weapons tomorrow, there would be peace. If Israel laid down its weapons tomorrow, there'd be another Holocaust. And I think those things still hold true today without question. What I say about concessions is that ultimately, if peace is going to be made, I'm sure there are going to be compromises. And Israel will have to think about those things. But I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that we need to get through two major hurdles. And again, I'm not trying to say that Israel's perfect and that Israel doesn't have decisions that it needs to make or policies that it needs to revise. I'm not here to defend everything that Israel's doing. It's not my job. But what I am saying is that I think we've got two hurdles. One is that the Palestinians need to accept the state of Israel and need to be willing to work side by side with it. You need to see the charter of Hamas revoked. You need to see the charter of the Fatah party revoked. Both of them call openly for the destruction of the state of Israel. You need to see the education system revamped. You need to see the media revamped. I mean, every part of the information system, the political system, the media, everything comes back to teaching that Israel does not, should not exist and should be destroyed.